The story of the respective home fronts during the Civil War is a very interesting and complicated one. The first thing people need to understand is that they're very different experiences depending on whether you live in the United States or the Confederacy. There are some commonalities. People on both sides became used to much more intrusive central governments. Both Abraham Lincoln and Jefferson Davis set aside the writ of habeas corpus at one time or another. On the United States side, of course, there was disruption. Congress passed income tax legislation and conscripted Union men into the Army, although if you live in the United States, you only had about a 1 in 2 chance of doing military service because the war didn't call on a higher percentage than that. The United States economy put in a very impressive performance. It proved fully up to the task of producing the vast amount of material that the United States military forces needed, while also producing all the civilian goods that society would normally want. It had a tremendous economic engine that hummed along during the war, and although inflation went up to about 80%, it did so without any kind of government intervention in the economy, and that's a rate about equal to what happened in World War II and World War I, with much more governmental intervention. On the Confederate side, there's wide-scale economic dislocation, tremendous damage done to the transportation and communication infrastructure. It took a great deal more intervention on the part of the Confederate government because the industrial base was so much smaller. The Confederacy actually set up state-sponsored industries to produce armaments and powder and other things during the war. There was nothing equivalent in the United States. There are also an array of both monetary taxes and eventually a tax in kind where the government would take a portion of crops and other things. The difference for women's experiences in the two nations was extreme. The vast majority of women in the United States carried on generally as they would in life, although many farm women assumed a much harder burden of work when their soldier husbands were off with the Army, but they didn't experience the economic hardships that hit women, especially poorer women, in the Confederacy. There were extreme shortages of food and even of very basic things such as clothing on the Confederate home front. And every level of government in the Confederacy stepped in to provide what we would call welfare-type assistance for poorer people, especially soldiers' wives in the Confederacy. There were times when women rioted in the Confederacy, especially in Richmond in 1863, because of shortages of food and other hardships that had been visited upon them by the war. But the real difference on the civilian side in the Confederacy was the profound dislocation to the normal activities of social life that the presence of United States armies brought. There are thousands of white refugees in the Confederacy, hundreds of thousands of black refugees in the Confederacy. In fact, the unraveling of the slave-based society in the Confederacy is one of the major themes of the home front on the Confederate side. As Union military forces penetrated deeper into the nation, it disrupted white control over African Americans, even as it disrupted the economy and transportation and almost every other element. In other words, did exactly the thing that the secessionists had hoped to avoid in leaving the Union in the first place. They brought on a war that brought armies to the Confederacy, that brought tremendous dislocation to almost every element of their economic, social, and political structures.